Thanks very much for joining us here on Point. I'm Nompumelelo Siziba. South Africa needs to urgently implement structural reforms if it's to turn the economy around. This is according to Old Mutual Investment Group chief economist Johann Els. He forecasts the economy will contract by 7.6% this year as the economy battles the effects of the coronavirus crisis. South Africa started the crisis in a weak position with the economy already in recession. Demands on the weak fiscus are rising, and so is the debt ratio to GDP. Els says South Africa needs to speedily implement structural reforms to boost growth and avoid a debt trap. He says government should implement the unbundling of Eskom, lower the cost of doing business, modernise ports and rail, as well as supporting sectors that can create jobs. He says with inflation expected to be low for the foreseeable future, the Reserve Bank has more room to further cut the repo rate. Well, for more on this, we're joined via Skype by Johann Els. He's chief economist at Old Mutual Investment Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Johann. So just tell us, in terms of the structural reforms that need to take place, what do you think are the low-hanging fruit that could be dealt with right away?
Yes, the stuff that we've heard from government over the last 2 years or so, like easing the business opportunities for private sector, restructuring state-owned enterprises, spectrum sale, etc. Those are things that's been promised, and then we've made a very slow start with those, unfortunately. But I think, yes, they will help on the margin. But I think the big reforms that we need to get this economy growing would be stuff like actually privatizing state-owned enterprises, actually deregulating the labor market, making it much easier for business to participate in economic activity. So the private sector's role in the economy must be significantly enhanced.
Yeah.
So huge reforms are needed, not just tinkering at the edges anymore.
Yeah. In the short term, though, of course, we have things like the interest rate as a lever that the Reserve Bank can pull on. And of course, this week they are meeting to decide as to what they'll do. You do expect that inflation is going to remain low for quite some time. What do you expect them to do? What would you encourage them to do if they had if you had their ear?
Yes, two very different issues there, because I expect them to only cut by 25 or maybe, if we're lucky, 50 basis points. However, I believe that the risk for inflation is on the downside, more risk of deflation, in other words, than higher inflation. And I believe at these juncture in time, very extraordinary, unprecedented circumstances regarding the weakness of economic growth and very, very low inflation, the Reserve Bank actually should cut by another 100 basis points at least. But as I said, they're unlikely to do that, but I think they can afford to cut far more. I would agree that they're not responsible for growth, but because the risk on inflation is so much on the downside, they can afford to cut rates.
Yeah. So apparently you also believe that quantitative easing could be a positive thing in the current context that South Africa's in. Please elaborate on that.
Yes. Well, I have to justify that by saying if there's a strong economic reform package, so policy reforms that will lead to higher economic growth, and there's a strong social compact, agreement between government, business and labor in terms of the things we're going to do to lift economic growth over the medium term on a more sustainable basis. Then I think the Reserve Bank can play a role in the very short term by buying up government debt to ease the constraints significantly more in the short term. But that should be part of a package of reforms.
Yes.
On its own, no, I don't believe QE, but quantitative easing as part of an economic reform package can play a role.
Still in terms of the short term, but which could obviously impact the long term, do you think government is perhaps getting it wrong in terms of the speed with which they're allowing certain sectors to open up? We know that a number of sectors are thinking about taking the government to court around this issue. And obviously, if we look at the restaurant sector, for example, they're not able to sell alcohol, and that's where they make most of their profit, not so much on the food. And obviously we don't know how long that situation is going to be open for. Thousands upon thousands of people will lose their jobs. Are we scoring an own goal in this regard? Because obviously if we pass this period and people lose their jobs and businesses close, it may be that much more difficult for them to be resuscitated.
Yeah, this is a very difficult one, and as you've realized, there's people on both sides of these arguments. I think the middle road is probably the best. It is difficult. We have these very high infection rates rising rapidly. We're surpassing lots of the other European economies regarding our infection rates. This is very difficult. We have to try and find this middle road between the impact in terms of the infection versus the impact on the economy. Not easy. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. As we see in the US, where the infection rates are going up, they're shutting down some of these services industries like restaurants and pubs, etc. So this is difficult. I think government has done a great job since the start of this crisis. There were some mistakes. I believe that they're trying to do the best for the economy versus the impact on people's health.
Yeah, lives versus livelihoods, a very difficult one indeed. Johann, thank you so much for your time. That was Johann Els. He's the chief economist at Old Mutual.